If someone had told me that a single name written wrong could decide the rest of my life, I would have laughed until it happened to me. My name is Kalian Virex, and I was never supposed to stand at that altar, not in that place, not in that moment, not in front of him, because I was not the heir, not the one chosen, not the Omega meant to be offered in a political alliance that carried more weight than I ever would. I was just the adopted son, the quiet replacement that existed in the background, useful when needed, invisible when not, and yet somehow, through a mistake no one wanted to correct, I became the center of something I had no right to belong to. I remember the day clearly, the way the air felt too still, the way every movement around me was precise and rehearsed, servants adjusting my clothes as if perfection could erase the fact that I should not have been there, and I asked once, quietly, "Is this really happening?" But no one answered, because answers would mean acknowledging the mistake, and silence was easier, silence always is. And so they dressed me, prepared me, guided me forward like I had been chosen all along. And when the doors opened, the world shifted into something that felt distant, unreal, a long aisle stretching ahead of me, lined with people who were not looking at me as a person, but as a symbol, a confirmation that the alliance would proceed as planned. And at the end of it stood Rajan Drax, the alpha I had only heard about in careful conversations, a man defined by control, by power, by a presence that did not need to demand attention because it already owned it. And when his eyes met mine, there was a pause, brief but undeniable, a flicker of something that did not belong to certainty. And for a second, I thought, maybe he would stop this, maybe he would see it, the mistake, the wrongness of it all, and say something, anything. But he did not. Instead, he held my gaze, steady, unreadable, and then simply said, "Proceed," like the word itself sealed everything in place, like it erased the possibility of anything being different. And just like that, I became his Omega, not through choice, not through understanding, but through acceptance of something neither of us had truly agreed to. And the ceremony passed in a blur of formal words and distant sounds, vows that felt less like promises and more like obligations written in a language I had never learned to speak. And when it was over, when the final moment settled into something irreversible, I stood beside him not as a stranger, not as a partner, but as something in between, something undefined. And as we walked away from the altar, I heard a voice behind me, soft but unmistakable, someone whispering, "That is not the one they selected." And another voice answering just as quietly, "It does not matter anymore." And I realized then that whatever this was, whatever my life had just become, it was not something that could be undone, because mistakes, when left uncorrected long enough, stop being mistakes and start becoming reality. And now, this reality belonged to me whether I wanted it or not. The first night in the Drax estate felt longer than any night I had ever lived through, not because anything happened, but because nothing did, and that silence carried more weight than any words ever could, because I did not know where to stand, what to do, or even what I was allowed to be in a place that was never meant for me. And the room they gave me was larger than the entire wing I had grown up in, the ceilings high, the windows tall, everything arranged with a kind of perfection that felt distant rather than comforting. And I remember standing there, still dressed in ceremonial white, staring at my own reflection like I was looking at someone else entirely, and I whispered, almost without realizing it, "This is not real." But the silence answered me the same way it always had, by confirming that it was, and when the door finally opened, I turned instinctively, my heart tightening in a way I could not control, because even without seeing him, I knew it was him, and Rajan stepped inside with the same composed presence he carried everywhere, as if nothing in this world could disrupt the order he had built around himself. And for a moment, we simply looked at each other, not as strangers exactly, but not as anything else either, and I found myself speaking before I could stop myself. "I was not the one you were supposed to marry." The words quiet but steady, because if there was ever a moment to say it, it had to be now, and he did not react immediately, his expression unreadable as always, his gaze resting on me like he was weighing something I could not see. And then he said, calmly, "I am aware," and something in my chest tightened at how easily he said it, like it had never been a question, like he had known from the beginning and chosen not to change it. And I took a small breath, forcing myself to continue. "Then, why did you not stop it?" And this time, there was a pause, not long, but enough to make the silence feel heavier. And when he finally answered, His voice was as steady as ever, because the outcome remains the same. And I did not know what to say to that, because to him, this was not about me, not about who I was or was not. It was about the alliance, the agreement, the structure that could not be altered without consequence. And I realized then that I was not part of a choice. I was part of a solution, and that understanding settled into me with a quiet finality that I could not ignore. And he stepped further into the room, his presence filling the space without effort, yet still maintaining that distance that made it clear where the line was. And he added, almost as if it were a formality, "You will be treated with respect here." And I nodded, because I did not expect anything more than that. Not warmth, not closeness, just stability. Something I could hold on to in a situation that had already taken everything else from me. And in the days that followed, that was exactly what he gave me. Nothing less, but certainly nothing more. Our interactions measured, brief, never unnecessary, meals shared in silence, conversations limited to what was required, and I adapted the only way I knew how, by observing, by learning the rhythms of the house, by making myself as unobtrusive as possible, because if I could not belong here, then at the very least, I could avoid disrupting it. But even as I settled into that routine, something beneath the surface began to shift, subtle at first, easy to ignore, a sense of unease that I could not fully explain, like the ground beneath me was not as steady as it appeared, and I tried to dismiss it, tried to convince myself that it was nothing more than adjustment, but deep down, I knew better, because this was not just discomfort, it was something deeper, something instinctive. And one night, as I stood alone in that same room that still did not feel like mine, I pressed my hand lightly against the edge of the table, my breath uneven as that feeling returned stronger than before, and I whispered to myself, barely audible, "Something is wrong." And for the first time since I had arrived, I realized that whatever this was, it was not something I could simply endure in silence. It did not feel like something that arrived suddenly. It felt like something that had been quietly building beneath the surface, something my body understood long before my mind was willing to admit it. And no matter how much I tried to ignore it, the signs became harder to dismiss, the restlessness that would not fade, the subtle shifts in my senses, the way the air itself seemed heavier, carrying something I could not fully control. And I stood there in my room, gripping the edge of the table. As my breath came uneven, trying to steady myself, trying to convince myself that I could manage it the same way I had managed everything else, quietly, without drawing attention, without disrupting the fragile balance I had worked so hard to maintain. But this was different. This was not something that could be hidden or ignored, and I whispered to myself again, more urgently this time, "No, not now," because I knew what it meant. I knew what was happening even before it fully took hold. An early heat cycle, triggered by everything I had been suppressing since the moment I stepped into this house, and panic followed immediately, sharp and overwhelming. Because this was not supposed to happen here, not in a place like this, not under these circumstances, and I tried to focus, to ground myself, to breathe the way I had been taught. But instinct does not listen to reason. It does not wait for permission, and the more I fought it, the more it slipped beyond my control, until even standing felt like an effort, until every thought became fragmented, scattered under the weight of something far more primal. And I did not hear the door at first, not until his voice cut through everything else, low and steady, "Kalian." And I froze, my entire body going still in a way that had nothing to do with control and everything to do with fear, because this was the one moment I had been trying to avoid, the one person I could not face like this. And slowly, I turned, my vision slightly unsteady as I met his gaze, and for a brief second, something flickered across his expression, not confusion, not anger, but recognition, immediate and precise, and I shook my head instinctively, taking a small step back as if distance could somehow fix this. "I am fine," I said, even though the words felt fragile the moment they left me, and he did not move closer right away, his posture controlled, his presence steady as always, but there was tension there now, something restrained, something deliberate. And when he spoke again, his voice was firmer, not harsh, but leaving no room for denial. "You are not." And the simplicity of it made everything feel more real, more unavoidable, and I could feel the space between us shifting, narrowing in a way that made it impossible to ignore what was happening. And he took a step forward, slow, measured, as if calculating every movement against something deeper, something instinctive that he refused to let take control. and I could see it. The restraint, the discipline that defined him being tested in a way I had never witnessed before, and it made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain, because this was not just my loss of control anymore. It was his battle against it as well, and when he reached out, it was not sudden, not forceful, but careful, grounded, like someone trying to stabilize a situation rather than claim it. And he said quietly, "Stay still." And I wanted to argue, wanted to step away, but I knew there was no other option, no other way through this. And in that moment, I understood something with a clarity that settled deep within me. This was not about closeness, not about choice. It was about necessity, about preventing something worse. And when I finally closed my eyes, letting go of the last bit of resistance I had been holding onto, the only thought that remained was a quiet, undeniable truth. Some moments in life are not chosen. They are simply endured, and they leave behind consequences that cannot be undone. When everything settled, it did not feel like relief. It felt like a quiet stillness that carried more weight than anything before it, as if the world had paused just long enough for reality to reshape itself into something I could no longer ignore. And when I opened my eyes again, the room was the same, the walls unchanged, the light still filtering in through the tall windows. But something inside me had shifted in a way that made everything feel different, and the first thing I noticed was the distance, not physical, but unmistakable, because Rajan was no longer close, no longer standing within reach. He had already stepped back, already restored the space between us as if that boundary had never been crossed, and I sat there slowly, my thoughts still unsteady, trying to piece together what had just happened. But the clarity came in fragments, in the memory of his voice, calm and controlled even in a moment that could have been anything but, in the way his actions had been. Precise, necessary, nothing more, and I realized that to him. This had not been a moment of connection. It had been a solution, a way to stabilize something that had gone beyond control, and that understanding settled into me with a quiet ache that I did not allow myself to acknowledge fully, because I had never expected anything else. And yet, expectation does not always protect you from feeling the difference. And when he finally spoke, his voice was as composed as ever, as if nothing had changed. "You should rest," he said, and I nodded, because there was nothing else to say, no question that needed to be asked, no explanation that would change the nature of what had already happened. And he turned without hesitation, moving toward the door with the same steady presence he always carried. And just before he stepped out, he paused for the briefest moment, not turning back, not looking at me, just a slight pause that felt almost like an unfinished thought, and then he left, and the silence that followed felt different from before, heavier, more defined, because now it carried something that could not be undone. And the days that came after did not shift in any visible way. The routines remained the same, the structure of the house unchanged, Rajan's behavior as controlled and distant as ever, as if nothing had occurred to alter the dynamic between us. And that was what made it more difficult to ignore, because I could feel the difference even if it was not acknowledged, a subtle awareness that lingered in every interaction, in every glance that did not last long enough to be noticed. And I tried to move forward the way I always had, quietly, carefully, maintaining the same balance that had allowed me to exist here without drawing attention. But it became impossible to fully ignore when my body began to respond in ways that left no room for doubt. The changes small at first, easy to dismiss, but growing more defined with each passing day, until one morning, standing alone in front of the mirror, my hand resting unconsciously against my abdomen, I felt it, not physically, not in a way that could be measured, but in a certainty that settled deep within me, and I whispered softly, almost afraid to hear it out loud, "This cannot be." But the truth did not change just because I questioned it. And when the physician confirmed it later that day, his voice calm, professional, as if he were stating something routine, something expected, it felt like the ground beneath me shifted in a way that could not be undone. Because this was not just a consequence. This was something permanent. Something that would tie me to this house, to him, in a way that went beyond contracts and obligations. And when I stood before Rajan again, the confirmation unspoken between us, I searched his expression for something, anything that might have changed, and when I finally found my voice, it was quieter than I intended. "What happens now?" And he looked at me, steady, composed, unchanged, and answered simply, "We proceed." And in that moment, I understood that whatever this meant for me, for my future, for everything I had yet to face, It did not change anything for him at all. The change did not come with an announcement. It came with a presence, quiet at first, almost unnoticeable if you were not paying attention. But in a house like this, even the smallest shift carried meaning. And I felt it before I understood it. The way the servants adjusted their tone, the way conversations paused just a second longer than usual, and I heard the name before I saw the person, spoken in a way that carried familiarity, not curiosity. Vareth has arrived. And something inside me stilled, because even without context, I knew that name mattered, and when I finally saw him, I understood why. He moved through the estate as if he had never left, as if every hallway already knew him, his presence effortless, composed, and there was a kind of refinement about him that made everything else feel slightly out of place, including me, and I stood at a distance, watching in the same way I had learned to watch everything else, quietly, without drawing attention, and then Rajan entered, and for the first time since I had known him, something changed, not in a way that was obvious, not in a way anyone would comment on, but I saw it, the subtle shift in his posture, the way his gaze settled with a familiarity I had never received, and Vareth smiled, soft, controlled, and said, "It has been a long time." And Rajan answered, just as calm, just as composed, "It has." But there was something beneath it, something unspoken that filled the space between them in a way I could not ignore, and I realized then that whatever this was, whatever existed between them, it had history, something that did not include me, something that had never needed me, and the understanding came, quietly, settling into place without resistance, because it explained everything, the distance, the lack of connection, the way I had always felt like I was standing in a space that belonged to someone else. And as the days passed, that feeling only grew stronger, because Vareth was everywhere, not intrusively, not in a way that broke the order of the house, but naturally, seamlessly, as if he had always been part of it. Walking beside Rajan in conversations I was never included in, sitting across from him at meals where I remained silent, present but not truly seen, and I adjusted the only way I knew how, by stepping further back, by ensuring that I did not interfere with something that clearly existed long before me. And yet, even as I did, there were moments that made it impossible to fully disappear, small interactions that carried more weight than they should have, like the first time Vareth spoke directly to me, his tone polite, his expression composed. "You must be Kalian," he said, and I nodded, keeping my voice steady. "I am." And he studied me for a brief second, not rudely, not openly critical, but with a kind of quiet assessment that made me feel like I was being measured against something I could not see. And then he smiled again, that same controlled softness, and added, "I have heard unexpected things about you." And I did not ask what he meant, because I already understood. I was the mistake, the deviation, the one who was not meant to be here, and he did not need to say it out loud for it to be clear. And as I stood there, maintaining the same composure I had learned to rely on, I realized something with a clarity that left no room for doubt. I had always known I did not belong here, but now, for the first time, I could see exactly who did, and the difference between us was not something I could ever change. It did not take long for the difference to become something I could no longer ignore, because Vareth was not careless, he was precise, and that made everything he did feel intentional even when it was subtle. And the more I observed, the clearer it became that the person everyone saw was not the person who existed when no one was watching. And I learned that truth in quiet moments, the kind that slipped between structured routines, because in front of Rajan, Vareth was everything he was expected to be, composed, attentive, his voice soft, his words measured. "You should not work so late," he would say, standing beside Rajan with a calm concern that felt natural, and Rajan would respond just as evenly, "It is necessary." And there would be an ease between them, a familiarity that did not need to be explained. But the moment Rajan was gone, the air shifted in a way that was impossible to miss. Not dramatically, not in a way that would draw attention, but enough for someone like me to notice. And I saw it first in the way he looked at the staff, not with respect, not even with indifference, but with a quiet expectation that made their movements sharper, more cautious, as if they were trying not to make a mistake that would not be forgiven. And I heard it in the way his tone changed, still controlled, still calm, but colder, stripped of the warmth he displayed so easily before. "That is not how this is done," he said once to a servant who had worked here longer than I had been alive, his voice low but firm, and the servant immediately lowered his head, apologizing, even though the mistake had been minor, almost unnoticeable, and I stood there, watching, feeling something unsettled form in my chest, because this was not how things were meant to be here, not in a house that valued structure over fear. And then there were the moments directed at me, brief, quiet, but deliberate, like the time we crossed paths in the hallway, and he paused just long enough to look at me with that same composed expression. "You seem comfortable," he said, his voice smooth, almost pleasant. But there was something beneath it, something sharp that did not match his words, and I met his gaze steadily, refusing to look away even though every instinct told me to. "I am fulfilling my role," I answered, keeping my tone even, and he smiled slightly, not warmly, but knowingly. "Of course you are," he replied, and then added, just softly enough that no one else would hear. "Temporary roles often feel permanent, until they are not." And he walked past me as if nothing had happened, as if those words had carried no weight at all, but they lingered long after he was gone, settling into the quiet spaces of my mind where I kept everything I could not say out loud. And I understood then that this was not accidental. This was not something that would change on its own. Vareth was not trying to remove me openly. He was shaping the space around me in a way that would eventually make my presence unnecessary. And I could have spoken up, could have tried to explain, but I knew it would not matter, because there was no evidence, no proof, only perception, and perception is easily dismissed when it does not align with what someone wants to believe. So I chose the only option I had left. I endured it the same way I had endured everything else, quietly, carefully, maintaining the routines that kept the house stable, ensuring that nothing I did would give anyone a reason to question my place here. Because even if I was not wanted, I refused to become a problem. And yet, despite everything, I could feel it, the tension beneath the surface, the quiet imbalance that was beginning to form. Because no matter how carefully something is hidden, the truth has a way of leaving traces, and sooner or later, someone was going to notice them. The moment everything began to shift, it did not announce itself with noise or confrontation. It revealed itself through something far quieter, far more unsettling. Because truth rarely arrives in dramatic ways. It slips into the spaces where illusion can no longer hold. And I witnessed it in a moment so ordinary that no one would have thought it mattered, except it did, because it changed everything. And it started with the elderly steward, a man who had served this house longer than I had even been alive, someone who moved with quiet dignity, someone who understood the rhythms of this estate better than anyone else. And yet that day, something small went wrong, a minor misplacement, a detail that could have been corrected with a simple word, but Vareth did not correct it. He addressed it. And there was a difference, his voice calm as always, controlled, measured. "Do you call this acceptable?" he asked, not loudly, not harshly, but with a precision that made the words feel heavier than they should have been. And the steward immediately straightened, lowering his head slightly. "My apologies, I will correct it immediately." And that should have been the end of it. But it was not, because Vareth did not stop there. He stepped closer, his presence still composed, still refined. But there was something in the way he continued, something that did not belong in this house. "You should have corrected it before it became visible," he said, and the words were not cruel. Not openly, but they carried a quiet dismissal that stripped away years of loyalty in a single sentence. And I felt it, the shift in the room, the subtle tension that formed when respect was replaced with something colder, something less forgiving. And I froze where I stood, not out of fear, but because I knew this was not right. This was not how things were done here. And that was when I felt it, the presence that changed everything, steady, controlled, unmistakable. And I turned slightly to see Rajan standing just beyond the doorway, silent, watching. And for the first time since Vareth had returned, there was no softness in his gaze, no quiet familiarity, only focus, only observation. And I realized then that this moment was no longer contained. It was no longer something hidden in the spaces where no one looked, because now, he was seeing it, not through memory, not through belief, but through reality. And the silence that followed felt heavier than anything before it, because Vareth noticed it too, the shift, the presence behind him. And for a brief second, something flickered across his expression, not enough for most to notice, but enough for me. And when he turned, his composure returned instantly, seamless, controlled. "It was a simple correction," he said calmly, as if nothing had happened, as if the tone, The weight of his words had not carried meaning beyond their surface, and Rajin did not respond immediately, his gaze lingering, assessing, and when he finally spoke, his voice was as steady as ever, but there was something different in it now, something sharper. It should have remained simple, he said, and that was all, no accusation, no confrontation, just a statement, but it was enough, because it acknowledged something that could no longer be ignored, and in that moment, I understood that the image Rajin had held onto, the one he had never questioned, had begun to fracture, not completely, not yet, but enough that the truth could no longer be dismissed, and as I stood there, watching it unfold, I realized that this was only the beginning, because once doubt enters, it does not leave easily, and no matter how much someone might try to hold on to what they believed, reality has a way of reshaping everything in the end. By the time everything unraveled, it no longer felt like something that could be prevented, only something that had been delayed, because once doubt takes root, it grows quietly, steadily, until it reaches a point where it can no longer be ignored. And I could feel that shift in Rajin long before anything was said out loud, in the way his attention lingered just a second longer than before, in the way his silence carried weight instead of indifference, and it unsettled something deep within me, because I knew what it meant when someone like him began to question what he had once accepted without hesitation, and yet, even with that awareness, I was not prepared for the moment everything finally broke, because it did not happen in a grand confrontation, it happened in something small, something precise, something carefully arranged, and I should have recognized it sooner. The subtle way Verith's behavior had shifted in the days leading up to it, the quiet calculation behind his words, the way his attention returned to me more often, not openly hostile, but deliberate, and that day, when the air felt just slightly heavier than usual, I understood too late that I had been placed into a situation I could not easily escape, and it happened in a single moment, a misstep that should not have occurred, a shift in balance that felt too exact, too controlled to be accidental. And as my footing faltered, my first instinct was not fear for myself, but for the life I carried, my hand moving instinctively to protect what mattered most. And I heard his voice immediately, calm, measured. "You should be more careful," Verith said, as if the entire situation had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. And I steadied myself as quickly as I could, my breath uneven, my thoughts racing as I tried to process what had just happened, because something about it felt wrong. Not just unfortunate, but intentional, and before I could respond, before I could even fully gather myself, he continued, his tone unchanged. "It would be unfortunate if your condition caused unnecessary complications." And the words settled into the space between us with a weight that was impossible to ignore, and for a brief second, I thought that would be the end of it, that this moment would pass the same way all the others had, quietly, without consequence. But then the air shifted in a way I had come to recognize, and I looked up to see Rajin standing there, not distant, not removed, but present, fully aware, his gaze fixed not on me, not on the aftermath, but on Verith, and there was something in his expression that had not been there before, not uncertainty, not hesitation, but clarity, sharp and undeniable. And the silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before, because this was not something that could be explained away, not something that could be reshaped into something more convenient, and for the first time, there was no illusion left to protect, and Verith saw it too, the shift, the realization, and for a brief moment, his composure faltered, just enough for the truth to show through before it was carefully restored. "It was an accident," he said smoothly, but the words no longer carried the same certainty, and Rajin did not respond immediately, his gaze unwavering, his presence steady in a way that felt different from before. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, controlled, but carrying something that could not be mistaken. "No," he said simply, and in that single word, everything changed, because it was not just a denial of what had been said. It was the end of something that had existed for far longer than I had been part of this house. And in that moment, I understood that the person Rajin had believed in, the one he had held on to without question, no longer existed in the way he thought. And that realization could not be undone, no matter what came after. By the time I decided to leave, it did not feel like a dramatic choice. It felt like something that had already been decided long before I ever put it into motion, because staying had never truly been an option. It had only been something I endured, something I convinced myself I could survive as long as I remained quiet. as long as I did not ask for more. But carrying this child changed everything, because this was no longer just about me, and I could not let my child grow up in a place where they would be seen the same way I had been, as a mistake, as something temporary, as something that could be replaced the moment it was no longer convenient. And so I waited, patiently, carefully, watching for the moment when the house would be quiet enough, when Rajan would be away long enough. Because even now, even after everything, I did not want confrontation. I did not want to stand in front of him and hear words that came too late to matter. And when that moment finally came, I moved. The way I always had, quietly, deliberately, gathering only what I needed, leaving behind everything else, because none of it had ever truly belonged to me. Not the room, not the clothes, not the life I had been placed into without choice. And as I stood in that space one last time, my hand resting lightly against my abdomen, I whispered softly, "We will be okay." Not as a promise I was certain of, but as one I was determined to keep. And then I left, without hesitation, without looking back. Because looking back would only make it harder to continue forward. And by the time Rajan returned, the house was exactly as it had always been, ordered, controlled, unchanged, except for one thing. I was no longer there. And at first, it was just an absence, something subtle, something that could be overlooked, until it could not, until the silence where I used to exist became too noticeable to ignore. And I imagined the moment he realized it, standing in a room that still carried traces of someone who was no longer there, the space too still, too empty in a way that did not match the structure he had built around himself. And I imagined the way his thoughts must have returned, uninvited, unavoidable, every moment replaying in a clarity that had not existed before, the way I had stood beside him without asking for anything, the way I had endured without complaint, the way I had protected his name even when I had no reason to, and most of all, the moment he finally saw the truth. Not just about Vareth, but about me, and what I had been all along, and I imagined the weight of that realization settling in too late, because regret does not arrive when it is needed, it arrives when it is no longer useful. And perhaps he called my name then, perhaps he searched the house, perhaps for the first time, he truly tried to find me, but it would not have mattered, because I was already gone. And some distances are not measured in miles, they are measured in moments that can never be undone. And by the time he understood what he had lost, I had already chosen a path where he could not follow, because I was never meant to stay, and this time, I chose to leave. Before I could be left behind again.